What is the darkest secret a restaurant can hide? We seek comfort in a shared meal, warmth in a steaming bowl on a cold night. We trust the hands that prepare our food. But behind the fragrant steam, behind the welcoming smile of the host and the fiery dance of the wok, there sometimes lies a truth so profoundly disturbing, it threatens to curdle the very blood in your veins. Tonight, we delve into a case that shattered a city's culinary soul, a case whispered in terrified tones by hardened detectives for years to come. They called it the spicy human flesh Hotpot case. Before we lift the lid on this horrifying tale, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Every subscription helps us to continue bringing you these deep dives into the shadows of the human experience. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time of night reserved for the city's ghosts and the weary souls who clean up after its living. For Detective Miles Corbin, it was just another Tuesday. For 40 years, the city's nocturnal symphony had been the soundtrack to his life, the distant wail of a siren, the hiss of street sweepers, the low hum of a world pretending to sleep. He was 6 months from retirement, a fact he reminded himself of like a mantra, a shield against the encroaching cynicism that threatened to consume him whole. His partner, Detective Isabella Chun, was 20 years his junior, a digital native who saw the city not as a concrete beast, but as a network of data points, a web of connections waiting to be illuminated. Where Miles saw shadows, Izzy saw signals. The initial report was as mundane as it was stomach-turning. A plumbing issue in the Crimson Lantern district. A commercial-grade grease trap blockage at a popular restaurant called the Sanguine Pot. The plumber, a man named Rico, had been called in after the neighboring businesses complained of a foul, sickly sweet odor emanating from the drains. It was Rico's panicked, gagging call to 911 that had escalated a municipal problem into a homicide investigation. "You've never smelled anything like it," Rico had stammered to the dispatcher, his voice cracking. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. But this, God, this is something else. It's not animal. It's wrong." By the time Corbin and Chen arrived, the block was already a sterile island in the grimy sea of the district. Yellow tape cordoned off the street, its stark color an affront to the warm, festive reds and golds of the surrounding lanterns. Uniformed officers stood in grim silhouettes against the flashing blue and red lights that painted the wet asphalt in chaotic, strobing hues. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a smell that was cloying and metallic, an unholy marriage of rancid fat and something vaguely organic. It was a scent that bypassed the nose and settled deep in the back of the throat. "Smells like a slaughterhouse forgot to pay its sanitation bill," Corbin grumbled, pulling the collar of his trench coat tighter as if it could ward off the stench. "Worse," Izzy said, her gaze already scanning, analyzing. Her face was pale under the flashing lights, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "A slaughterhouse smells like death. This smells like digestion." They met the forensic team's lead, Dr. Eris Thorne, at the entrance to the Sanguine Pot. Thorne was a man who seemed to have been carved from granite, his face a mask of stoic professionalism that had been weathered by countless horrors. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miles, Izzy," he nodded, handing them both disposable booties and gloves. "Don't touch anything that isn't already bagged. The patrolmen who did the initial sweep are over there, trying not to redecorate the pavement." He gestured with his chin towards 2 young officers looking green around the gills. The plumber was right. It's wrong. The Sanguine Pot was, by all outward appearances, a successful establishment. The interior was tastefully decorated with dark wood, brushed metal, and intricate lattice screens. Tables were still set with pristine white bowls and elegant chopsticks. On one table, a half-finished glass of wine sat next to a neatly folded napkin. It was a portrait of normalcy, frozen in time. The only thing out of place was the silence. The usual clatter of dishes and lively chatter of diners was replaced by an oppressive, humming quiet that seemed to amplify the smell. "Place looks clean," Izzy noted, her voice a low murmur. "Too clean." Corbin grunted in agreement. It was true. The floors were spotless, the tables immaculate. It had the sterile, almost soulless feel of a showroom, not a restaurant at the end of a busy service. No spills, no stray crumbs, no life. Thorne led them past the dining area and through a swinging door into the kitchen. And that's where the illusion of normalcy shattered into a million jagged pieces. The kitchen itself was a temple of stainless steel, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was like the dining room, unervingly clean. The counters were wiped down. The utensils were arranged with geometric precision. The massive stockpots were polished to a mirror shine. It was a chef's dream, a health inspector's fantasy. But the source of the malevolent odor was immediately apparent. A large metal grate in the center of the floor had been pried open, revealing a dark, viscous morass below. This was the grease trap. Corbin, a man who had seen bodies pulled from rivers and fire-gutted buildings, felt his stomach lurch. The stench that billowed from the pit was a physical force, an invisible wave of putrescence. It was the smell of decay, concentrated and magnified. The plumber, Rico, he used an industrial snake to try and clear the line from the basement access point. Thorne explained, his voice flat, detached. He pulled up a mass, fibrous tissue, congealed lipids, and something else. He thought it was a large cut of pork that had gone bad and been stupidly shoved down the drain. It wasn't pork, was it, Eris? Corbin asked, though he already knew the answer. Thorne shook his head slowly. The initial field test was positive for human proteins. But it was the other things we found that were more disturbing. He pointed to a stainless steel table where several evidence bags were laid out in a neat row. The mass was bound together with hair, long, dark human hair, and mixed in with the tissue, we found these. He indicated a small bag containing several tiny, almost microscopic objects. Izzy leaned in, her flashlight clicking on to illuminate the contents. They were fragments of bone, chipped and scored, and something else. Small, perfectly manicured fingernails, still bearing the faint remnants of glossy red polish. Izzy took a sharp, involuntary breath. Corbin remained silent, his jaw tightening. There's more, Thorne continued, his voice dropping even lower. We scoped the main drain line leading from this trap. It's choked with the stuff. Congealed fat, tissue, more bone fragments. It's not one deposit. It's years of deposits, layered on top of each other like sedimentary rock. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a disposal system. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the humming of a refrigerator the only sound. The implications of Thorne's words hung in the air, as thick and foul as the stench from the floor. This wasn't just a murder scene. It was a factory. The owner, Corbin finally asked, his voice raspy. The staff. That's where it gets strange, Izzy said, already tapping away at her department-issued tablet. The restaurant is registered to a sole proprietor, a man named Julian Voss. He's also the head chef. According to employment records, he has a small staff, 2 servers, a dishwasher. We're running their names now. But Voss is a ghost. No social media, no driver's license on file, no credit cards active in the last 5 years. The business license was paid in cash, and the lease on this place was secured through a shell corporation with an offshore bank account. He's a phantom who runs a very popular restaurant, Corbin mused, his eyes scanning the kitchen. He walked over to a large spice rack, filled with dozens of glass jars containing exotic herbs and powders. The labels were handwritten in elegant, precise calligraphy. Szechuan peppercorns, star anise, black cardamom, fennel seed. The usual suspects for a high-end hotpot restaurant. But then he saw another set of jars, pushed to the back, their labels written in a language he didn't recognize. Izzy, what do you make of this? He called over. She came to his side, pulling up a translation app on her tablet. She snapped a photo of the characters. The app whirred for a second before displaying the result. It's a dead language, she said, her brow furrowed in confusion. An obscure dialect of ancient Aramaic. The labels translate to things like the weeping of orphans, the laughter of the condemned, and essence of the final breath. A chill, colder than the refrigerated air, snaked its way down Corbin's spine. This was beyond murder. This was something else entirely. It was ritual. It was art. Twisted, depraved, monstrous art. What kind of hot pot was this place famous for? Corbin asked, turning back to Thorne. Thorne looked grim. Their signature dish. It won awards. The critics raved about it. They called it the Crimson Embrace. A spicy broth, known for its incredible depth of flavor. A richness that no one could quite identify. They said it was unforgettable. The word hung in the sterile air. Unforgettable. The patrons had been consuming more than just a meal. They had been consuming a secret, a horror, ladled out in porcelain bowls. Every rave review, every satisfied customer, was a testament to the monster who had presided over this kitchen. Corbin walked over to the main cooking station. A single, enormous stockpot sat on the industrial-sized gas burner. It was cold now, but a dark, reddish-brown residue coated the inside. He stared into its depths, and for a moment, he imagined it bubbling, steam rising, carrying with it the fragrant aroma of spices and the silent screams of the ingredients within. He served them, Corbin said, his voice barely a whisper. He cooked them and he served them to people. We need to shut down the district's water reclamation plants, Izzy said, her voice urgent as the full scope of the horror dawned on her. We need to analyze the entire sewer system for this quadrant. We don't know how much material has been flushed. We could be looking at multiple victims, dozens even. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion, a single body dumped in an alley. This was a meticulous, long-term operation. A charnel house disguised as a gourmet restaurant. The staff, Corbin said, refocusing. The servers, the dishwasher. Find them, and find everything you can on Julian Voss. This phantom chef had to exist somewhere. He bought supplies, he paid rent, he talked to people. Someone, somewhere, knows who he is. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky in sickly shades of gray and pink, the forensics team began the gruesome task of excavating the grease trap. They worked in shifts, their faces hidden behind masks and protective gear, their movements slow and deliberate. They were no longer just police officers and scientists. They were archaeologists, digging through the layers of a modern tomb. Corbin and Chun stood outside, the yellow tape separating them from the world that was slowly waking up. The smell still clung to their clothes, to their hair, to the inside of their nostrils. It was a smell Corbin knew he would never forget. His phone buzzed. It was Thorne. Miles. The medical examiner's voice was strained, stripped of its usual professional calm. You need to see this. They went back inside. The main dining room was now a makeshift command center, buzzing with technicians and investigators. Thorne led them not to the kitchen, but to a small, private dining room in the back, one that had been locked. The forensics team had just forced it open. The room was bare, except for a single, large, ornate table in the center. On the table was a place setting for one. A pristine bowl, a silver ladle, a pair of ivory chopsticks, and next to the bowl a small, leather-bound book. A journal. Izzy, gloved and careful, opened it. The pages were filled with the same elegant, precise calligraphy from the spice jars. But this was not Aramaic. It was English. It was a menu. Corsai, the impatient food critic, a man of shallow palate and venomous words, simmered with galangal and white pepper to purify his bitter soul. Course 2, the jealous rival, a chef from across the street who sought to steal my secrets, braised with star anise and cassia bark to sweeten his envy. Course 3, the lonely tourist, a woman from a distant land, so full of wanderlust, infused with Szechuan peppercorns to replicate the tingle of new experiences on the tongue. Page after page, it detailed not recipes but victims. Each entry described a person, their perceived flaws, and the specific combination of spices used to capture their essence in the broth. It was a ledger of methodical slaughter, a culinary diary from the deepest circle of hell. Corbin felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just about disposal. This was a ceremony. Julian Voss wasn't just a killer. He was a gourmand of the grotesque. He didn't just hide his victims. He curated them, seasoned them, and served them as his magnum opus. Izzy flipped to the last page. There was only one entry, written in ink that was still fresh. Tonight's special, The Devoted Apprentice. A young man so eager to please, so desperate to learn the final secret of the broth. His loyalty has a flavor all its own. The dishwasher, Izzy breathed. His name is Alex, a culinary student. He was reported missing by his roommate 2 days ago. He told him he was staying late to help Chef Voss with a new recipe. The final secret of the broth. The horror of it settled over them, a suffocating blanket. The young man hadn't just been murdered. He had been the latest ingredient. Corbin's phone buzzed again. He answered it, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. It was the forensics lab supervisor. Detective. The voice on the other end was shaking. We've started the DNA sequencing from the primary sample from the grease trap. The one the plumber pulled up. What is it? Corbin asked, his voice low and dangerous. There was a pause, a moment of crackling silence on the line. It's not one victim, detective. Or two. Or even three. The sample is a composite. A blend. So far, we've isolated the genetic markers for at least 12 different individuals. Corbin closed his eyes. 12 individuals. A dozen lives. Rendered down. Reduced to a complex flavor profile in a madman's pot. And that was just from the first sample. The pipes, choked with years of this horror, held the stories of countless more. The sanguine pot hadn't just been serving Hotpot. It had been serving a graveyard. And the chef, the phantom artist Julian Voss, was still out there. The city awoke to a nightmare. The story of the sanguine pot broke like a fever, spreading through news channels and social media with viral intensity. It was dubbed the Hotpot Horror, a name that was both lurid and chillingly accurate. Viridia City, a metropolis that prided itself on its culinary scene, was suddenly forced to confront a monstrous truth lurking beneath the surface of its celebrated gastronomy. Every restaurant review was now read with a shudder, every exotic dish eyed with suspicion. The trust between diner and chef, a bond as old as civilization itself, had been poisoned. For the task force assigned to the case, the public hysteria was a storm they had to navigate while simultaneously sailing into the heart of a hurricane. The precinct became a pressure cooker. Calls flooded the tip line crank theories, false sightings of Julian Voss, and dozens of frantic reports from people who had eaten at the restaurant, their panic palpable through the phone lines. Detective Miles Corbin insulated himself from the chaos, transforming his small cubicle into a shrine dedicated to the phantom chef. The walls were covered with crime scene photos, lists of potential victims compiled from missing persons reports, and every scrap of information they had on Julian Voss. It wasn't much. The man was a master of anonymity. He had paid for everything in cash, lived in an apartment registered to another shell corporation, and had left behind no fingerprints, no stray hairs, no biological trace of his existence. He had moved through the world like a ghost, his only real presence confined to the four walls of his blood-soaked kitchen. Detective Izzy Chin, meanwhile, dove into the digital abyss. She lived on coffee and the glow of her multiple monitors, chasing Voss's electronic shadow. He has to have made a mistake, she insisted, her fingers flying across the keyboard. In this day and age, no one is truly invisible. Everyone leaves a footprint. She cross-referenced the names from Voss's menu, with missing persons reports dating back 5 years, the date the restaurant had opened. The matches began to pile up, each one a small tragedy. The impatient food critic was a well-known blogger who had vanished after posting a scathing review of a rival restaurant. The lonely tourist was a Japanese woman whose last known photo, posted on her travel blog, was of her smiling outside the sanguine pot, captioned, "Time for a taste of the real Viridia." The devoted apprentice, Alex, was a bright-eyed culinary student whose horrified parents now sat in a sterile interview room, trying to reconcile the image of their ambitious son with the ghoulish fate he had met. Each confirmed victim only deepened the mystery of the killer. The victims were diverse men and women, old and young, from different walks of life. There was no clear pattern, no obvious type. The only thing they had in common was that their paths, in one way or another, had crossed with Julian Voss. The first major break came not from a digital trail, but from old-fashioned police work. A canvass of suppliers in the Crimson Lantern district finally yielded a lead. An elderly woman who ran a small specialty spice shop recalled a peculiar customer. "He came in once a month, always at closing time," she told Corbin, her voice thin and reedy. "A very quiet man, very polite. He always wore gloves, even in the summer. I thought it was strange. He had dead eyes, like a shark. Empty." She said he never bought the common spices. He purchased obscure, often bitter or pungent roots and seeds in bulk. But the most important piece of information she gave them was about his deliveries. He had once complained about the difficulty of transporting his purchases and had asked her if she knew a reliable, off-the-books delivery service. He needed someone who didn't ask questions. The delivery driver was a nervous man named Sal who operated his business out of the back of a beat-up van. Under the threat of having his entire illegal enterprise dismantled, he talked. He had made several deliveries for Voss, not to the restaurant, but to a nondescript warehouse in the city's industrial sector. The raid on the warehouse was conducted with the silent, tense precision of a bomb squad. Corbin, Chan, and a dozen SWAT officers breached the steel door and entered what appeared to be another one of Voss's temples of sterile horror. It wasn't a kitchen. It was a laboratory and a library. One side of the vast space was taken up by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with thousands of volumes. There were cookbooks from every culture and historical period, but they were interspersed with anatomy textbooks, surgical manuals, and philosophical treatises on mortality and existentialism. There were historical accounts of cannibalistic tribes, biographies of serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer and Albert Fish, and rare, leather-bound tomes on medieval alchemy. The other side of the warehouse was a state-of-the-art chemistry lab. Centrifuges, distillation kits, vacuum sealers, and custom-built pressure cookers stood in gleaming rows. This was where Voss had experimented, where he had perfected his gruesome craft. This was where he had rendered his victims down, breaking them apart into their fundamental components. "My God," Izzy whispered, walking through the aisles of equipment. He wasn't just cooking them. He was extracting them, creating distillates, essences. On a long steel table, they found his research notes. They were even more detailed and disturbing than the menu journal. Voss wrote with the dispassionate precision of a research scientist. He documented his experiments in rendering human fat, preserving tissue, and creating flavor profiles based on a victim's diet, emotional state, and even their cause of death. He wrote about the Maillard reaction on human flesh and the umami signature of the pancreas. It was the detached, scientific language of his notes that was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his madness. He saw his victims not as people but as raw materials. He was an alchemist, and his great work was turning human life into a fleeting sensory experience. "He's a culinary terrorist," Corbin said, his voice thick with revulsion. "He's not just killing people, he's trying to prove a point. He thinks this is art." In the back of the warehouse, they found a walk-in freezer. Corbin and Chen exchanged a grim look before pulling the heavy door open. It wasn't filled with bodies. It was filled with hundreds of small, neatly labeled, vacuum-sealed packages, organized with chilling precision on metal shelves. Each package contained a different cut of meat, a different rendered fat, or a different powdered substance. The labels were simple. Subject 17, liver. Subject 21, adipose tissue. Subject 14, bone marrow powdered. It was a pantry of human suffering. But Julian Voss himself was gone. The warehouse had been recently abandoned. He had cleared his personal effects, wiped the surfaces, and vanished again. He was a ghost who had simply shed another skin. The only thing he had left behind was a message. It was placed in the very center of the laboratory floor. A single, perfect Szechuan peppercorn sat on a small, velvet cushion. Next to it was a note, printed on expensive cardstock. You have found the studio, but you cannot comprehend the art. You mistake the butcher's tools for the painter's brush. My work is not about death. It is about transcendence. I give these hollow lives a purpose, a meaning they could never achieve on their own. I turn their fleeting, mundane existence into a single, perfect moment of culinary bliss. It is the ultimate act of consumption, the ultimate form of immortality. Do you begin to understand? Or are your palates still too dull? The note was a gauntlet thrown down, a direct taunt. Voss was watching them. He knew they were getting closer, and he was reveling in it. The investigation had become part of his performance. The discovery of the warehouse and the killer's note sent a fresh wave of terror through the city. The mayor held a press conference, flanked by a grim-faced Corbin, and assured the public that every resource was being dedicated to capturing the butcher of Viridia. But the fear was now tangible. People were afraid to eat out, afraid to trust their neighbors. The social fabric of the city was fraying. Izzy, driven by a cold fury, redoubled her efforts. She took the note and the journals and fed them into a forensic linguistics program, analyzing Voss's sentence structure, his word choice, his syntax. He's an academic, she concluded after days of analysis. Highly educated, probably a doctorate. His writing style is precise, almost clinical, but there's a theatrical arrogance to it. He sees himself as a teacher, a philosopher. She began cross-referencing university databases, looking for anyone who had pursued a dual PhD in chemistry and philosophy, or culinary arts and anthropology. The search was a needle in a haystack of global academic records. Meanwhile, Corbin took a different approach. He went back to the victims. He spent hours with their families, looking at photo albums, learning about their lives. He wanted to understand them not as ingredients in Voss's recipes, but as people. He was searching for a connection, a link that Voss might have overlooked. He found it in the story of the jealous rival, a chef named Marcus Thorne, no relation to Dr. Thorne. Marcus had been the head chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant that had been dethroned in the city's top food rankings by the Sanguine Pot 2 years prior. Marcus's wife told Corbin that her husband had become obsessed with Voss. He said Voss was a fraud, she said, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Marcus was classically trained. He believed in technique, in tradition. He said Voss's flavors were unnatural. He accused him of using chemical additives, flavor enhancers that no legitimate chef would touch. He even sent samples of the broth to a lab for testing, but the results came back inconclusive. They couldn't identify the core components. This was the key. Voss hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He had competed. He had entered the culinary world and dominated it. Izzy narrowed her search, focusing on former students of elite, international culinary academies who had dropped out or been expelled. And then, she found him. His name wasn't Julian Voss. It was Alistair Finch. He had been a prodigy, a brilliant student at the world's most prestigious culinary institute in France. He excelled in molecular gastronomy, the science of food. But he had been expelled for unethical and dangerous experimentation. His final thesis proposal had been a manifesto on what he called experiential gastronomy, arguing that the final, forbidden ingredient in the pursuit of ultimate flavor was human flesh. He had been dismissed as a dangerous eccentric, a madman, and had vanished completely. They finally had a face. A photo from his student file showed a young man with intense, dark eyes and a faint, condescending smile. He was the shark the spice shop owner had described. He was the ghost. The discovery of his true identity unlocked a flood of new information. Alistair Finch had inherited a small fortune from his reclusive family, which explained his ability to fund his operations with untraceable cash. He had traveled the world, studying not just cooking, but obscure tribal rituals and ancient embalming techniques. He was a monster of intellect and obsession, but knowing his name didn't tell them where he was. He could be anywhere in the world by now. The task force felt a crushing sense of defeat. They were always one step behind him. It was Corbin who refused to give up. He stared at the taunting note left at the warehouse, reading it over and over. My work is not about death. It is about transcendence. He's not finished, Corbin said to Izzy, his voice low. This isn't just a game of cat and mouse for him. He called it his great work. An artist doesn't abandon his masterpiece halfway through. The note wasn't a farewell. It was an invitation to the final act. Izzy looked at him, a new hope dawning in her exhausted eyes. What are you thinking? He talks about transcendence, about creating a perfect moment. That sounds like a finale, Corbin said. He's been serving his art to a random, unsuspecting public. But a true artist, a true egomaniac, wants his work to be appreciated by those who can understand it. He wants a worthy audience. Corbin's eyes drifted to a calendar on the wall. His gaze locked onto a date circled in red. It was the annual Viridia Restaurant Association Gala, the most prestigious culinary event of the year, where the city's top chefs, critics, and gourmands gathered. It was in 3 days. He's going to cater the main event, Corbin breathed, the horrible certainty of it washing over him. Izzy's face went white. That's impossible. The security is airtight. The menu has been set for months. The head chef is a legend. Is he? Corbin countered, his mind racing. Or is he just another man who can be made to disappear? For Voss, it would be the ultimate performance. To have the entire culinary world, the very people whose praise he both craves and despises, feast upon his creation. To have them unknowingly cannibalize one of their own. It's the perfect, final, depraved joke. The theory was audacious, almost unthinkable. But it fit perfectly with the profile of Alistair Finch, the arrogant, theatrical, phantom chef. He wasn't running. He was preparing for his opening night. And the city's elite were about to become his final, captive audience. The Viridia Grand Hotel was the city's crown jewel, a bastion of old-world luxury and modern opulence. On the night of the Restaurant Association Gala, it was a glittering spectacle. The air hummed with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of the city's culinary elite. Renowned chefs in their starched whites mingled with powerful critics in designer gowns, all blissfully unaware that they were walking into the final act of a madman's opera. The Viridia PD, acting on Corbin's terrifying hypothesis, had transformed the gala into the most elaborate sting operation in the city's history. SWAT teams were disguised as hotel staff, communication specialists monitored every signal in and out of the building, and snipers were positioned on rooftops, their scopes trained on the hotel's entrances. Izzy and her team had taken over the hotel's security hub, their faces illuminated by the ghostly blue glow of 100 camera feeds. They were watching every hallway, every kitchen, every pantry. Corbin was on the inside, dressed in an ill-fitting tuxedo, a communication bead hidden in his ear. He felt like a caged animal, the polite chatter and classical music grating on his raw nerves. Every smiling waiter, every clatter from the kitchen, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. They had quietly confirmed that the gala's celebrated guest chef, Antoine Dubois, had missed his last 2 check-ins. His phone went straight to voicemail. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. The trap was set, but Corbin knew they were at a disadvantage. They were reacting to Voss playing on his stage. Anything, Izzy? He muttered into his cufflink. Negative. Her voice crackled in his ear. The kitchen staff all checked out. Their IDs are legit. The head chef matches the file photo of the guy they brought in from the hotel's main kitchen. If Voss is here, he's a ghost. The appetizers were served. Corbin watched, his heart pounding, as the city's most refined palates sampled delicate canapés and artisanal bites. He half expected people to start collapsing, but nothing happened. The courses continued, each one perfectly executed, exquisite, and, according to the forensic chemical sniffer team in the kitchen, perfectly normal. Doubt began to creep into Corbin's mind. Had he been wrong? Had Voss simply vanished, leaving them to chase shadows at a fancy party? The main course was announced. A consommé, described on the menu as Chef Dubois's Essence of Autumn. A rich, clear broth with a single, perfectly poached quail egg. The waiters, who were all undercover officers, began to file out of the kitchen, carrying silver tureens. "Hold," Corbin commanded into his mic. "Team, intercept the soup. Now." Subtly, the officers, trained for this moment, moved with fluid grace. They intercepted their fellow waiters, creating minor, plausible distractions of feigned stumble, a request for assistance, and rerouted the tureens to a secure antechamber where a mobile forensics lab was waiting. Dr. Eris Thorne, looking as grim in a tuxedo as he did in scrubs, worked with swift efficiency. He drew a sample of the clear amber liquid. The first test was for toxins. Negative. The second was for narcotics. Negative. The third was the one that mattered. The protein analysis. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Corbin watched the ballroom on a small monitor, watched the guests looking expectantly towards the kitchen doors. Thorne's voice, when it came over the comms, was tight with a mixture of horror and discovery. "Miles, it's clean. There's no human protein in this broth. It's a simple, albeit perfectly made, mushroom and game fowl consommé. It's completely safe." Corbin felt a wave of confusion. Had he misjudged everything? Was this all a massive, embarrassing false alarm? "But," Thorne continued, his voice dropping, "I found something else. The chemical signature. The unique flavor profile from the sanguine pot is here. Not from the ingredients themselves, but as a trace element. An infusion. I don't know how, but he seasoned this broth with the memory of his victims." Before Corbin could process this, Izzy's voice cut in, sharp and urgent. "Miles, I've got him. I think I've got him." "Where?" "Not in the kitchen. Above it. The hotel has a private chef's table, a glass-encased dining room that overlooks the main kitchen. It's booked for a private party tonight. The reservation was made a month ago under a false name. We've had a camera on it, but the lights were off. They just came on. And Miles, the guest of honor is Antoine Dubois. He's tied to a chair." Corbin's blood ran cold. It was the ultimate act of arrogant cruelty. Voss wasn't cooking the victim. He was forcing the victim to watch as his name and reputation were used to serve a tainted masterpiece. "And the chef serving him?" Corbin asked, already moving towards the service elevator. "It's him," Izzy said. "He's shaved his head, wearing glasses, but the facial recognition confirms it. Alistair Finch. He's in a chef's uniform, serving Dubois his own consommé." Voss hadn't taken over the whole kitchen. That would have been too crude, too risky. He had inserted himself into a small, isolated part of it, a place where he could preside over his final performance like a Roman emperor in a private box. "He's not serving the same soup, is he, Izzy?" Corbin asked, the dreadful answer already forming in his mind. There was a pause. "God, no," she whispered. "The tureen on Dubois's table. It's different. It came from a separate container. A thermal carafe he brought with him. He was serving the real Crimson Embrace to its horrified, captive audience of one. Move in. All teams, converge on the chef's table." Quietly, Corbin ordered as he sprinted down a service corridor. Corbin was the first to arrive. He peered through the one-way glass of the corridor wall. The scene inside was surreal. Alistair Finch, aka Julian Voss, stood with perfect posture, a silver ladle in his hand. He was speaking softly to the terrified, gagged Chef Dubois, who was weeping silently. Voss was explaining the flavor notes, the ingredients, the philosophy behind the horrific broth he was placing in front of him. This wasn't a hostage situation. It was a lecture. Corbin didn't wait for backup. He kicked the door open, his weapon raised. "Police! Drop it, Voss!" Voss didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He turned his head slowly, and a faint, condescending smile touched his lips, the same smile from his student photograph. "Detective Corbin," he said, his voice calm and cultured. "You have an impressively persistent palate. I was wondering if you'd make it in time for the final tasting." He held the ladle up, not as a weapon, but as a toast. "You are just in time to bear witness. I am liberating Chef Du Bois from the prison of his own tired, predictable cuisine. I am offering him a taste of the sublime, a taste of truth. The only thing you're offering him is a death sentence. You psycho? Corbin snarled, his finger tight on the trigger. Death. Voss chuckled, a dry, academic sound. Detective, you still don't understand. This is not about death. It is about the reduction of life to its purest form, flavor. To be consumed, to be appreciated, to become a part of something greater. It is a form of immortality far more potent than a name on a restaurant sign. From behind Corbin, SWAT officers began to flood the room, their laser sights painting a dozen red dots on Voss's chest. Voss ignored them, his dark, empty eyes fixed on Corbin. You see a monster, Voss said softly. I see an artist who is willing to do what others will not. To explore the final taboo in the name of creating one perfect, fleeting moment. Can you honestly tell me that the world is worse off without a bitter food critic? Or a jealous rival? It was the classic psychopathic defense, the arrogant justification of a man who saw people as objects. But it was the cold, rational calmness with which he said it that chilled Corbin to the bone. They were people, you son of a bitch, Corbin said, his voice a low growl. They had lives, families. They weren't ingredients. Everything is an ingredient, detective, Voss replied. We are all just complex arrangements of proteins and minerals, waiting to be broken down, waiting to be consumed, whether by worms in the ground or by a more discerning connoisseur. In that moment, with a dozen guns trained on him, Voss made his move. But it wasn't towards a weapon. With a sudden, fluid motion, he brought the ladle to his own lips and drank deeply from the horrific broth. No! Izzy screamed from the doorway. Voss closed his eyes, a look of ecstatic bliss on his face. Sublime, he whispered. Then his eyes snapped open, his body convulsed, and a line of foam appeared on his lips. He collapsed to the floor, his body twitching violently. Medics! Corbin yelled, even as he kept his gun trained on the writhing figure. Dr. Thorne rushed in, a medical kit in his hand. He took one look at Voss's dilated pupils and the bluish tint to his skin. It's a fast-acting neurotoxin, Thorne announced. Derived from a rare Amazonian frog, if I had to guess. Odorless, tasteless. He must have coated the inside of the ladle. The ultimate poison pill. Alistair Finch, the Phantom Chef, had served his final dish to himself. He had chosen to be consumed by his own art, a final, narcissistic act of self-transcendence. He died on the floor of the glass-encased dining room, a faint, satisfied smile etched on his face. In the aftermath, the city tried to heal. The story of Alistair Finch became a cautionary tale, a legend of modern horror. The sanguine pot was demolished, but the memory of what happened there lingered like a phantom taste in the back of the city's throat. The rescued Chef Du Bois retired, never to cook again. Weeks later, Corbin and Sean sat in a simple, quiet diner. Corbin's retirement was official. He stirred his black coffee, watching the steam rise. Izzy was picking at a salad, her appetite still not fully returned. The silence between them was comfortable, born of a shared trauma that no one else could ever understand. You know, Corbin said, breaking the quiet, the thing that gets me, the thing I can't shake, is that for a single moment in that room he almost made sense. For one insane second, his whole twisted philosophy sounded logical. Izzy looked up, her eyes dark with the memory. That's the real horror, Miles. It isn't the monster who looks and acts like a monster. It's the one who can stand in front of you, explain the beauty of his own evil, and make you question for a split second what's right and wrong. Corbin nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He looked out the window at the city, at the people rushing by, all of them on their way to their next meal, their next bite, their next taste of life. The bond of trust was being slowly, tentatively rebuilt. But for him and for Izzy, a simple meal would never be simple again. They had confronted the horror of the spicy human flesh Hotpot case, and in doing so had been forced to look into the abyss. And the abyss, as it always does, had looked back, leaving an aftertaste of dread that would never truly fade.